Well, there's a lot going on today, isn't there? We have a lot of things that need some attention. We don't have internet. We don't have a phone. We were having issues with our PowerPoint this morning. It can really frustrate and aggravate you. It can really sort of ruffle your feathers and mangle your day. But in the grand scheme of things, it's tiny stuff. Stuff we'll get over. Stuff that we don't have to give much energy or power to. I imagine what might have been going through the minds of those people on September 11th as they were making their way into Manhattan on a subway, possibly with a taxi cab. Maybe some of them lived close enough to walk. They made their way into the towers, thinking that they would be home later that night. Probably thinking of their chores that they had to do, bills that were due, things that they wanted to get accomplished. Maybe they had some plans for that evening. And little did they know that their time was done. Not to forget those other folks that suffered and were lost that day, those who were killed in the field in Pennsylvania, Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Those who were killed when the plane flew into the Pentagon. Each one of them had their life. They had their own life. And they thought, just like you and me, that it was going to be going on like it normally would later on that day, until fate threw them a curveball. I remember growing up, my father used to always say, I remember where I was when Kennedy was shot. And I remember that being an event that everybody sort of tagged and said, you know where you were when Kennedy was shot. Maybe some of you here were alive back then and remember. If you are, please, raise your hand or share. And I immediately thought when I experienced September 11th that this was the event of this generation where everybody would remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when they saw the images of two planes flying into buildings. For me, I was in my living room, and my kids were at school. My wife was at work, and I was working on some music. And my wife calls me. She goes, "Oh my God, turn on the television." What's going on? She goes, "There's a plane that hit one of the Twin Towers. It's all over the news." And at the time, she worked for a newspaper, so they were getting all kinds of reports, on their wire there. And she goes, "Turn on the television." So immediately I ran to the television, and I was shocked. I used to live in New York. I used to live 50 miles from there, and I'd been probably in 1989 or 1990. I'd been to the top of the World Trade Center. It was a really cool building. I remember the bottom floor, it had a flag of every nation in the world. I do remember that. And I just remember it being an awe-inspiring view from up top. And it didn't make the connection right away that this was a terrorist act. Until about 10 minutes after I started watching, I watched in horror, like everyone else who was watching, the second plane flying into the second building. And then we all sort of collectively knew that this just wasn't a random, unfortunate occurrence. This was a very intentional act that was perpetrated by an unspeakable evil. Pretty soon after that, we got a call from the school. We were bringing the kids home. My wife came home from work early, and we all just sat around wondering what the heck was going on with our country. At the same time, there were rumors of a plane maybe that was hijacked, that was crashing in Pennsylvania, and then there was another that was headed to the Pentagon, and then I think I remember hearing a report of something that there was one that was headed toward the Capitol building. It was chaos for sure. Chaos. Was just amazed at just how shocking those events were. I think it was surreal to me. It was like it really wasn't happening, like I was really watching a bad movie, although I wasn't. These things were really happening. We were confused, we were dazed, we had got, as a boxer, had gotten smacked with a right hook that we just were having a hard time shaking our head and shaking it off, saying, what in the world just happened to our city in New York? What in the world just happened to our country? So as I was preparing to talk about 9/11, I decided I was going to trying to understand what and why and who this happened. Why did this happen? What kind of unspeakable evil would perpetrate something of this nature? One of the little factoids that I discovered that really shocked me. Maybe I should have known this, but it just didn't jump out at me right away, and as I researched it, the average age of the hijackers was 24. Now, if you take away the ringleader, who was 33, and two of the other leaders that were 28 and 29, you have an average age of 16 of the 19 hijackers being 22.8 years old. You think back to our youth when we were that age. Maybe some of us were just getting out of college. Maybe some of us, I know at that time I was just ending my first hitch in the Navy. It was just staggering to me that these people who were so young would take part in something. And to me, the overwhelming feeling of this event meant there was some major mind manipulation and brainwashing to very impressionable minds. Notice there was no 40 or 50-year-olds jumping in a plane and flying it into a building. I guess they had made a deal with Allah at that point. Idealism tampered without wisdom is a dangerous mix. These people had subscribed to, they were going to be going to their heaven and possibly greeted by 7 virgins or something, whatever they believed. But they believed they were doing it in the name of Allah, in the name of God. But where did they get their ideology from? Well, it's very easy to group people into the religion of Islam and say, oh, they were Muslims and they're all bad. Islam is the largest religion in the world. It has over 1 billion followers. It surpasses Catholicism and Christianity as the largest religion in the world. But just like the Islamic faith, the Muslims, Christianity has their fringe beliefs. You've heard of the Army of God, and if you haven't heard of the Army of God, you've certainly heard of some of their followers. Eric Rudolph, who was the Olympic Park bombing in 1996, who's in prison now for life for not only that bombing, but for the bombing of several abortion clinics. He sort of waved that under the Christian flag. He was doing God's work. He was doing God's will. There was a doctor here just about 5 or 6 years ago that was shot and killed in Olathe or Overland Park, I believe. Guy drove by and he was doing the work of the Lord. I thought, how unfair would it be for someone to look at Christianity and say, I don't want to be a part of that group. Look what those Christians do. It goes without saying that we had our own Inquisition and the terror and the torture that we inflicted on those who were not Christian. So, although I recognize the affiliation with Islam, I also recognize that this is a very small fringe group of Muslims. The hijackers were all part of an ultra-conservative reform movement called Salafi. And the Salafi movement has 3 sects. The quietists, those who avoid politics altogether. The activists, those who engage in politics. And lastly, and unfortunately, they have the jihadists. Those form a small minority of this ultra-conservative movement. The last group, the jihadists, they base their beliefs in a physical jihad and the returning to what the adherents believe to be true Sunni Islam. They are aggressively seeking to eliminate anything or anyone that they find challenging to Islam. The Western ideology, the Jewish faith are mortal enemies of this Islamic extremist. And they will not compromise. They will not be tolerant of Western life at all. We hear the word Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda is a word that means a base of military operations. And they have garnered enough people, an army, so to speak, to continue their jihad against Western idea and philosophies. Just like all religions, they have mystics and writers and people who influence them. Who was the influence of Osama bin Laden? He was influenced by a writer by the name of Sayyid Qutb, who was a very ultra-conservative guy who called for physical retaliation. And really, the fact that America was camped out in Saudi Arabia during the Afghan war with Russia, this upset Osama bin Laden quite a bit. And the fact that we had a diplomatic tie with Israel and angered him even more. And this caused him to use his resources. He came from a very wealthy family to pull together and to create an organization that would smite the infidels, that would restore this idea of Salafism to the world. We're not dealing with people who are right thinking or have balance. They are zealots. There's always been hostility between Muslims and Jews and Christians. It even roots back to the Bible when the story of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar Ishmael and Isaac. Abraham is considered the father of both religions, Judaism and also Islam. And strangely enough, we have the story in the Bible where Abraham, his faith was tested. His faith was, God said, we want you to sacrifice your son. Lay him on this altar to show your fidelity to me. And then at the last minute, a ram was provided and spared. It's a very Christian or a very Jewish story that we adapt as Christians. However, the Islamic faith recognizes that sacrificed child as that being of Ishmael. So we have a very big controversy from the start. Not to mention that Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn. And in the scripture of the Bible it says, for he is your only child. So there is some explaining to do from the Christian perspective of how that is the truth. And trust me, there's dialogue out there that will defend that idea that it was still Isaac, so don't fear. But we get tied up into our ideologies and what we believe, and history writes itself, doesn't it? In the Bible, though, it says that because Sarah was jealous and Hagar suffered greatly at her hand, that Abraham finally let them go. And it said that Ishmael would be the father of many nations, many people. And he has been, as we see the race of Islam has grown. But this division is rooted as far back as the very beginning of the religions themselves. So I thought I'd want to read what Fillmore has to say about races and race consciousness. And I thought what he had to say was really fantastic in the revealing word. I don't want to share it to you verbatim. Fillmore says, the human race has formed the laws of physical birth and earth, death, laws of sickness and physical inability, laws making food the source of bodily existence, laws of mind that recognize no other source of existence except the physical. The sum total of these laws forms race consciousness, separate from the independent of the creative mind. When creative mind sought to help men spiritually, the mind of the flesh opposed it and made every effort to solve its problems in its own way. The great need of the human family is mind control. Jesus showed us that the mastery is attained through the realization and the power of spirit. He also goes on to talk about the race errors, erroneous race thoughts that bind mankind to sin, disease, poverty, war, calamity, and death. And he defines race mind as totally of beliefs, thoughts, memories, feelings, and experiences of the race. Man has built into the race mind a consciousness of corruptible flesh instead of the inherent corruptible substance of God mind. So as we remember 9/11 on this day, are we going to remember it with our physical mind or our God mind? Are we able to embrace Islamic brothers and sisters in a way that doesn't leave us with hatred in our hearts and bigotry in our soul? No one said it would be easy. But somehow there is a way that we are all connected. We are connected with all of these brothers and sisters. And the beliefs of Christianity have evolved in the way that they have over time, and we've adopted them as our own. and the beliefs of Islam have evolved over time, and those others have adopted that as their own. But really, what is our own? Is that of spirit? Is that of love? And so today, in our closing, as we remember those nearly 3,000 lives that were lost that day, let us embrace love as our religion. Let us seek first to understand as opposed to being understood. Let us love our neighbor as ourself. Let us give love unconditionally. And let us do this, that knowing that as we change ourselves, we change the world around us. Love is our religion. It might have a Christian dress on it, but love is our religion.